Europe is preparing to send up to 50,000 soldiers to Ukraine. The continent has had enough of Putin. Russia's leader has been allowed to run roughshod in Ukraine for long enough, threatening the rest of Europe as he does, and it's time to put an end to his imperialistic ambitions. But how exactly is that going to happen? Is Europe getting ready to send 50,000 soldiers to fight for Ukraine, much like North Korean President Kim Jong-un sent around 12,000 of his soldiers to do battle in Kursk? Or does Europe have something else in mind? And what will all of that mean for the Ukraine war going forward? We start with the most important question: what's actually happening? On January 23rd, reports started to surface that several European countries had entered discussions among themselves over the possibility of sending a peacekeeping force to Ukraine. That force, which French President Emmanuel Macron suggested in early 2024, would involve somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 troops, with their goal being to create a demilitarized zone, or DMZ, between Ukraine and Russia, through which neither side could penetrate. The European force wouldn't be involved in any active fighting, the reports claim. Rather, they would be a barrier to keep Ukraine and Russia apart, stationed along a pre-agreed border between Ukraine and Russia. The proposal comes on the back of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's claims that his country is open to a ceasefire of some description, though that arrangement could only be reached with the full support of Ukraine's allies. A just peace wouldn't be possible without them, meaning no European boots on the ground would result in it being just a matter of time before Putin's forces invade again. Macron supports this idea. He joined Zelensky for a conversation in January 2025, in which France's president reportedly said that the possibility of sending French soldiers into Ukraine existed. As one of these guarantees, Zelensky said in the wake of the meeting when referring to France's guarantees of helping Ukraine protect itself, "We discussed the French initiative to deploy military contingents to Ukraine. We considered practical steps for its implementation, possible expansion, and involvement of other countries in the process." And it's not just France that's considering sending troops into Ukraine, the UK is considering getting in on the act. MSN reports that preliminary planning to assemble these forces is already underway in the UK and France, with the likes of the Netherlands, the Nordic countries of Sweden, Finland and Norway, and the Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia also considering sending troops. Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer is also believed to be preparing for an informal meeting with NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte to discuss the idea further. Even if it was only France and the UK that contributed to the 50,000 troops, that might be enough. The UK has an active military of 184,860 people, according to military aggregator Global Firepower. France's active military has 200,000 soldiers, meaning the two combine to have 384,860. Extracting 50,000 soldiers from those standing armies could be problematic. It would represent a collective weakening of about 12.5%, but both also have reserves. The UK could even pull the entire 50,000 from the 924,000 reserves it has. So 50,000 European troops to Ukraine is doable, even if it's only France and the UK contributing. However, there's a key barrier standing in front of the plan: Vladimir Putin. Russia's leader outright rejected the idea of any European nation sending their troops into Ukraine via Russia's Minister of Foreign Affairs Sergei Lavrov on February 18th. Lavrov said, "The presence of troops from NATO countries, whether under foreign flags, EU flags, or their own national flags, does not change anything. This is, of course, unacceptable to us." Those comments came in the aftermath of US President Donald Trump's meeting with Russian leadership in Saudi Arabia. That meeting started the discussion about how to deliver peace to Ukraine, only it was lacking a key party: Ukraine itself. Russia's leadership have also called on the West to disavow a promise made in 2008 that signaled Ukraine could one day join NATO. Putin's message is simple. He doesn't want any NATO troops, peacekeeping or otherwise, stationed in Ukraine, and he also doesn't want his enemy to become part of the collective defense force that represents the sternest challenge to his authority. This rejection calls the entire proposal into question. However, it doesn't eliminate the driving factors that led to these discussions about European troops serving as peacekeepers in the first place. Macron's initial comments about sending European soldiers into Ukraine likely planted the seeds. He made those comments in February 2024, pointing out that there is a change in Russia's stance. It's striving to take on further territory, and it has its eyes not just on Ukraine, but on many other countries as well. So Russia is presenting a greater danger. Initially, France's European allies tried to distance themselves from the French president's remarks. Even Macron had to admit that there was no consensus on the idea of sending ground troops into Ukraine. Now, that consensus seems to be appearing. Part of the reason might be the ascendancy of Donald Trump to the role of US president. The Financial Times claims that Trump's return to the White House has reignited interest in Macron's idea. Trump aims to end the Ukraine war as quickly as possible, ideally via a peace plan, and the Financial Times suggests he's also looking to disentangle the US from European security in general. February 21st saw Friedrich Merz, Germany's next chancellor, suggest that the loss of the US from NATO is a definite possibility. We must prepare for the possibility that Donald Trump will no longer uphold NATO's mutual defense commitment unconditionally, said Merz in an interview. He called for Europe to make the greatest possible efforts to ensure its forces are capable of defending the continent. Sending 50,000 soldiers into Ukraine as a peacekeeping force would help Europe do that. Preparing those 50,000 troops for a potential fight with Putin also seems high on the agenda. Add to that the ever-dwindling prospect of Ukraine joining NATO, which doesn't seem possible while Putin wages war in the country, and many in Europe are starting to see the idea of sending troops into the country as a realistic possibility. None of those European countries want to join the fight. However, France, the UK and several others now seem to believe that projecting power while maintaining a peacekeeping capacity could be enough to dissuade Putin from pushing his special military operation further. And with Trump potentially pulling the US out of the picture, or at least minimizing his country's involvement, now is the time to start showing Trump that the rest of Europe is ready. By deploying 50,000 troops, Europe would also benefit in two ways. It can continue to show support for Ukraine while reducing the amount the continent collectively spends on delivering military aid to the country. Plus, a joint effort to send these 50,000 troops would allow European nations to deepen their own security ties, which many would see as vital if they believe that Putin truly intends to shift his focus to other nations should he win in Ukraine. There's also Zelensky himself to consider. On January 21st, The Guardian reported on Zelensky's appearance at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. While there, Ukraine's president said, Europe must establish itself as a strong global player, as an indispensable player, before claiming that Ukraine would need at least 200,000 allied European troops to protect it and the rest of the continent from Putin's ambitions. The speech was framed by the concept of Europe learning to take care of itself due to the possibility of President Trump withdrawing US support. Zelensky even went as far as to claim that 200,000 would be a minimum, otherwise it's nothing. Ukraine's president backpedaled from that figure somewhat a couple of days later, telling Bloomberg that he actually told a journalist, maybe more, maybe less, when referring to the 200,000 figure. That claim runs contrary to what he said in Davos, which may be because the 200,000 figure is somewhat unrealistic. As the Financial Times points out, that's even more than the number of soldiers who took part in the D-Day landings during World War II. The 50,000 figure, currently being bandied about, is far more feasible, claims the outlet, with Kyiv apparently also warming up to the idea of having that contingent patrolling a 620-mile-plus front line. It appears that a lot of behind-the-scenes negotiations have been taking place between Ukraine and its European allies. Still, it's important to point out one thing. Though discussions are clearly ramping up, no soldiers are going to be sent to Ukraine anytime soon. We aren't going to see 50,000 European troops charge into Ukraine overnight. That would be an escalation that could push Putin into drastic action against Ukraine and the rest of Europe, especially given his February comments about not allowing any NATO troops into Ukraine. Any European boots on the ground in Ukraine would only arrive after careful consideration among Ukraine's partners, which isn't happening right now, and under the auspices of a peace plan to which Russia agreed. At the same time, Europe can't afford to spend too long dithering about whether to commit these troops. With Trump seeming determined to achieve peace, or at least a ceasefire, between Ukraine and Russia, European countries will need to be prepared to step up. That's especially the case if what's believed to most likely be Trump's peace plan comes to fruition. On January 28, the European Conservative reported on a leaked version of Trump's supposed 100-day plan for ending the Ukraine war. Under that plan, Ukraine would have to declare itself neutral and forego any aspirations of achieving NATO membership at least until 2030. In return, Europe would help to take care of the country's post-war reconstruction, which is likely where a DMZ staffed by the 50,000 European troops would come into play, and the US would continue to provide military support while Ukraine could maintain its current military. The plan also calls for the deployment of an international peacekeeping force, again likely with heavy European involvement, with Ukraine also having to cede the territory it's lost so far to Russia and promise not to try and take it back. It's likely that this is the plan that Trump discussed with Putin in Saudi Arabia. Trump may still want to push for it even if Putin outright rejects the idea of European peacekeeping forces. Let's assume for a moment that Putin relents and does allow a European peacekeeping force to enter Ukraine. What would it look like? Former NATO official and current European Council on Foreign Relations member Camille Grand says robustness is the priority. Any European troop contingent would have to be robust enough to not be a soft target that Russia would immediately test, and big enough so that it does not require immediate reinforcement and is not seen as a backdoor commitment by NATO, he tells the Financial Times. That last point is especially important. Deploying these troops could already be seen as an escalation by Putin. Any whiff of NATO involvement would only cause further escalation, especially given that Russia's leader has accused NATO of using Ukraine as a proxy, almost since the beginning of his special military operation. There's a balance to strike here. Grand suggests NATO could maintain some sort of involvement in the context of the Berlin Plus format, which is an agreement that allows the European Union or EU to use some of NATO's planning capabilities to facilitate actions such as these. The EU has already used that format in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it would allow for the UK involvement in sending troops into Ukraine without Putin being able to directly accuse NATO of getting involved. As for what the DMZ itself looks like, it's possible that Europe would consider something similar to the divide that exists between North and South Korea. Those countries maintain a DMZ that soldiers from both countries patrol, creating a line through which either would have to break to start a war. The idea may be to do the same between Russia and Ukraine. The DMZ will be an early warning system for both that the other is on the attack. And while Britain and France seem to be the frontrunners in terms of supplying the troops that would patrol the DMZ, there are other European countries that would likely be involved. Estonia has been discussing the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine since May 2024, with the other Baltic state of Lithuania having also said it was prepared to send around 100 soldiers to help train Ukrainian troops. Perhaps those 100 could be repurposed for DMZ patrol, should the concept of sending 50,000 European soldiers into Ukraine become a reality. The idea then is to have a multi-country European force stationed in Ukraine that acts separately from NATO, is strong enough to project force to Russia without over-escalating, and can help to foster a ceasefire that allows Ukraine to rebuild. So there are clear goals in mind for the 50,000 European soldiers. Still, the plan isn't perfect. There are some problems with the idea of sending 50,000 European soldiers into Ukraine, even under the auspices of maintaining peace, that need to be confronted before it can happen. Chief among them is a problem that's existed in Europe whenever the prospect of putting boots on the ground in Ukraine comes up, getting the countries that might be involved to agree on how and if to do it. We often make the mistake of thinking of Europe as some sort of single entity in which everybody is singing from the same hymn sheet. That's not the case. There are 44 countries in Europe, not all of which are part of the EU, and each of which has its own goals and ambitions. Even EU members aren't necessarily going to agree with each other. We saw this when Macron first proposed sending soldiers into Ukraine. That proposal was met with several replies by European leaders, many in the negative. Sweden's Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson ruled out the possibility entirely, with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz also being quick to point out that no agreement on the issue had been reached. Fast forward to today, and Europe is at least more aware of the danger that Putin poses. However, that doesn't mean that all are suddenly jumping at the chance to antagonize Russia's leader further. As International Institute for Strategic Studies senior advisor Francois Heisbourg puts it, this is a purely hypothetical option. It will be extremely difficult for Europeans to agree among themselves, almost as difficult as getting Ukraine and Russia to agree on a settlement. In other words, the how and who of sending 50,000 troops hasn't been agreed yet, and it's only a minority of European countries that seem to be on board with the early version of the plan. Speaking of getting Ukraine and Russia to agree on a settlement, that raises another issue. The 50,000 troops plan is a non-starter if Putin doesn't agree to it. That seems to be what's happening following Trump's meeting with Putin in Saudi Arabia. Part of the problem, AP News points out, is that Putin views Ukraine as part of Russia. It shouldn't be part of the West. Europe should have no real say in what happens to it. So the thought of allowing European troops to separate him from what he believes is rightfully Russia's might not even enter his head. That's the opinion of former Russian diplomat Boris Bondarev. Putin would never say yes to this, claimed the diplomat who left Russia when Putin started his war. There's also a possibility that Putin would make European troops entering Ukraine one of his red lines. Plenty of those lines have been crossed already during the war, but this is one that would give those nations thinking of sending troops a reason to pause. They don't want to risk escalation. The Trump factor may come into play here. On January 22nd, President Trump wrote the following on Truth Social: "I'm going to do Russia, whose economy is failing, and President Putin a very big favor. Settle now and stop this ridiculous war. It's only going to get worse. If we don't make a deal and soon, I have no other choice but to put high levels of taxes, tariffs and sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States and various other participating countries." However, Trump has since changed his tune. Trump is now publicly blaming Zelensky for Putin's war, claiming on February 21st that he's sick of how Ukraine's president has handled the conflict. "I've been watching this man for years now, as his cities get demolished, as his people get killed, as the soldiers get decimated," said Trump on the Brian Kilmeade show. "I've been watching for years and I've been watching him negotiate with no cards. He has no cards, and you get sick of it. You just get sick of it, and I've had it." Trump is now threatening the EU with tariffs rather than Russia. He's essentially become a wild card in Europe's plans to send 50,000 troops into Ukraine. One month he supports the idea, at least if rumors of how he's formulating his peace plan are to be believed. The next, he's blaming Zelensky for the war and meeting with Putin without Ukraine's involvement, suggesting that he's going to push for a more Russia-friendly version of peace. Finally, there's one more factor to consider: the Kremlin. We mentioned earlier that Putin has long acted as though the West is using Ukraine as a proxy to wage a war against Russia. That's an opinion Putin has worked hard to encourage within the Kremlin, with any notion of him going back on it to allow European troops to patrol near Russia potentially being grounds for him to be ousted. That's the opinion of Director of Objective Ukraine, Simon Woodiwiss. Speaking to Times Radio on January 24th, Woodiwiss said, "One of the things he's been forcing down the throats of people in Russia is that we went into Ukraine to stop Ukraine, to stop NATO troops entering, to stop Ukraine from becoming a NATO member." Woodiwiss points out that allowing any European troops, be that the 200,000 Zelensky wants or the 50,000 being proposed now, to waltz in as part of a peacekeeping force would be a contradiction of the message Putin has delivered from the start. He might risk being seen as a liar by his own people or, perhaps worse for Putin, a weakling. That's why Putin is now saying no to the idea of a European peacekeeping force. "I don't think that's going to be good for his health," Woodiwiss says when referring to Putin potentially allowing 50,000 European troops to patrol Russia's border with Ukraine. Someone, particularly someone even more hawkish than him, will obviously have something to say about that. By this point, Putin is so deeply entrenched in his own propaganda that the concept of allowing European soldiers near his country could mean he gets ousted or even killed by one of his political opponents. If that's the case, even a peace deal that sees Russia take the approximately 18% of Ukraine it currently controls might be out of the question if European troops with any ties at all to NATO are involved. Perhaps Putin is waiting to see if the US pulls its support for Ukraine. If it does, he might believe that continuing the fight is better for Russia because it would slowly win, leaving him in control of the country he's always wanted, along with a route into the rest of Europe in the future. Europe is getting ready to send 50,000 troops into Ukraine. At this point, some would argue that it has to if it wants to ward off Putin's ambitions and support any kind of peace between Ukraine and Russia. The questions now are whether these boots on the ground are coming too late, and will Putin even allow them to enter Ukraine? Let us know your thoughts about that in the comments. What impact would the 50,000 European troops have on the Ukraine war? Will Putin allow a peacekeeping force to enter Ukraine in the future? Please share your thoughts and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Even the US is Shocked. Europe has had enough of Russia, strikes back, or click this other video instead.